Good afternoon and happy Sunday. We're here to read a story that we started before COVID-19 social isolation began. Can I say that 3 times fast? Social isolation began. It was Flat Stanley. Here we go, Flat Stanley. And we were going to, oh wait, there's a hand in the background. It's one of my kids. You have a question?
In 3rd grade, I made my own Flat Stanley, and I flew it to my uncle, who he took pictures so I could show it for my class for show and tell.
Ah, where did your Flat Stanley go?
To Washington, D.C., I think.
You went to Washington, D.C.? Do you remember what areas in D.C. your Flat Stanley visited?
No.
Did he visit any famous places in D.C., your Flat Stanley? Do you remember?
No.
Were there any pictures your uncle sent back?
Yes.
Okay. What pictures did your uncle
He
send
was
back?
in front of the fountain.
Okay. From your trips to D.C., what area is that called? Maybe you can ask a classmate here. Pick a friend.
Virginia.
That's where there is. How about you, friend?
What's the question?
Phone another friend.
Teacher Maria.
Okay, your mom will help you here. It visited the Lincoln Memorial, I believe. Is that what you're talking about? But it visited the White House. It looked like they were in front of the where the press meetings are held inside the White House.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
It's been so long.
good job. And your dad was no help. Phone another friend next time. Okay, so now my class is going to continue reading Flat Stanley, and when we're done, we shall write up and make our own Flat Stanley and send it. So let's get started. We are not going to finish the book today. We are just going to do chapter 2. We left off on chapter 3 last time. This one is Stanley the Kite. Can you see that? Can you see that? It says, Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons. Mr. Lambchop is Stanley's father, and the other boy is Stanley's brother, to a museum or roller skating in the park. But it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop would worry about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might, let's turn the page, accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel. A parcel's like a package. And he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. So Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. On Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop. Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper, Mr. Jones said. Going to decorate your house, I suppose? I think he's talking about Flat Stanley. Wallpaper, said Mr. Lambchop. Oh, no, this is my son Stanley. He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. How do you do, Stanley? How do you do, Stanley said. Nice to meet you, young feller, the man said. George, he said to Mr. Lambchop, that boy is flat. Smart too, Mr. Lambchop said. Stanley is third from the top in his class at school. Phooey, said Arthur. This is my younger son, Arthur, Mr. Lambchop said. Here we are. Here's a picture that shows, oh, that's Arthur with a whole bunch of books on top. I wonder what he's trying to do. Let's find out. Mr. Lambchop said, and he will apologize for his rudeness. Uh-oh. He's a little upset that Arthur, the younger son, was being rude. I think he's jealous because Flat Stanley's getting all the attention. That might be why he has all those books in front of him. He's probably trying to get flat like his brother Stanley, who's getting all the attention now when they're walking around. Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur laying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. Well, the Encyclopedia Britannica, let me explain, it was a set of books that would give us a whole bunch of information back in the day before there was the internet and we needed to find information. We used to go to the encyclopedias. Now we just look it up on the internet. However, the Encyclopedia Britannica actually was actual facts. You can't always rely on everything being actual on the internet. Let's keep going now. Put some more on me, Arthur said when he saw them. Don't just stand there. Help me. There he is. He wants to get flat, so he told his parents to put more books on him. He wants to get flat, just like Stanley. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop set him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. Arthur can't help being jealous, he said. They said, be nice to him. You're his big brother after all. The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. Someday, he said, I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest, and I will be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. You can fly me, Arthur, he said. Come on. He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind, carefully a little at a time, so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down. And there he is, up in the air. Look at him go, Flat Stanley, flying higher than most of the kites. I don't see any other kites. So he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above trees and a beautiful sighed in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley and Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running. Yeah, it takes a lot of work to fly a kite. Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley was right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice while he was eating the hot dog that the wind was blowing and the string tangled it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until Leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross at him. Cross is another word for upset or mad. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mr. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. With Mr. Lambchop in the living room was Mrs. Lambchop. Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. You were at the office all day having fun, she said. You don't realize what I go through with the boys. They're very difficult. Kids are all like that, Mr. Lambchop said. Phases. Be patient, dear. And that's the end of that chapter 3, and we shall come back to chapter 4 on another day. Thank you, and see you tomorrow on Monday for another lesson.